Hey guys, so today we're going to be talking about the Progressive Era. The Progressive Era is just a time of a ton of reform all across the United States. Some of this included women's rights, living conditions, working conditions, and also monopolies and trusts. So most of the progressive reforms were spearheaded by the middle class, and we're going to be looking at all of this through a tree. So first we're going to start off by talking about muckrakers. Muckrakers were just the authors, editors, and reporters who made the public aware of all the awful things happening across the nation. So one of the famous muckrakers is Jacob Riis. He wrote the book How the Other Half Lives. He was a famous photojournalist, and he really just outlined and described how the living conditions and the tenement housing was just so awful. Another muckraker is Samuel Sidney McClure, and he founded the McClure magazine. He also published many series of articles just explaining what was going on. So one of the authors of the series was Ida Tarbell, and she exposed the Standard Oil Company, which was Rockefeller's company. Another muckraker is Lincoln Steffens. He wrote the book Shame of the Cities, and that just revealed all of the corrupt deals politicians and businesses were making. So we are going to write labor here, and then we're going to write muckrakers here. Next, we're going to talk about Wisconsin Governor Robert La Follette. He passed what is now known as the Wisconsin Idea. This included a series of progressive reforms such as direct elections, tax reform, and state regulatory commissions. All these commissions did was monitor businesses like insurance companies. Moving on to President Theodore Roosevelt, he was the youngest and most athletic president in history, and he assumed office after President William McKinley was assassinated in 1901. Roosevelt really just reshaped the way that the executive office was viewed. He guided what legislation Congress was working on at the time. So one of his first things was improving labor conditions, and he did this with the Square Deal. So coal miners were on strike, and Americans were flipping out because they were scared that they weren't going to have enough coal for the winter. So with the lack of coal, Roosevelt called a meeting between the union leader and the company owners and basically told the owners, look, you got to honor their deals. My constituents are flipping out. You got to do something, or I'm going to send in troops and take over your company. So, of course, the owner honored the union's leader's request, and the workers gained a 10% wage increase in a 9-hour workday. In 1904, Roosevelt was up for re-election, and he won by a landslide. So Roosevelt in his second term really worked to enforce the Sherman Antitrust Act, and with this act, he tried to end the practice of trusts and monopolies. So one of his first ones was the Northern Securities Company, and they had a ton of control over the railroad business. So Supreme Court allowed Roosevelt to do what he needed to do. So Roosevelt then directed the Attorney General, like, hey, let's go get the Standard Oil Company, or Rockefeller's company, and along with 40 other monopolies and trusts. So that's what we're gonna write right here. So the reason that there's like this divide here, you know, obviously this is a tree. So these are our roots of the tree, because these are the roots of the problem. And then the progressive reformers, I'll write that right here. They really just built up to all of these beautiful branches so that the world can improve. So next, Roosevelt tried to, the public was really just upset at the regulation and the conservation and the preservation of natural resources. So you may be asking, well, what's the difference between conservation and preservation? Conservation is just regulating how many materials or how much materials any given company is using. So, and preservation is just stopping the humans from leaving their imprint on the environment. So one of the first things that Roosevelt did was he used the Forest Reserve Act of 1891 to make 150 million acres federal land. And then in 1902, Roosevelt signed into law the Newlands Reclamation Act. So what that did was it helped farmers in the West by providing irrigation. And then towards the end of his term, in 1908, the National Conservation Commission was developed under Gifford Pinchot of Pennsylvania. He was also the first director of the U.S. Forest Service. We're going to write conservation. And preservation. And then we're going to write Roosevelt up here. Okay. Also, during Roosevelt's term, The Jungle, written by Upton Sinclair, was published. And while it was a fiction book, it provided very real and accurate descriptions of what the meat package industry looked like. It described how the meat on the floor was being scooped into the pot, and also how workers' fingers would be cut, that everything was just scooped into the pot to be packaged and sold to the American public. So after this book was published and gained popularity, the public was crying out for Congress and the president to do something, create some form of legislation to stop this. So the Pure Food and Drug Act was signed, and that required drugs to be properly labeled. Also, the Meat Inspection Act allowed investigators to inspect and make sure that federal sanitation standards were being met. So next we're going to move on to William Howard Taft. He had served as Roosevelt's Secretary of War, and Roosevelt pretty much just picked Taft to be his successor, and the Republican Party followed in step with that. And the Democratic nominee was William Jennings Bryan. Taft signed into law the 16th Amendment, which created the federal income tax. And so that was greatly appreciated because it taxed the wealthiest people, not the poor, not the middle class, the wealthiest. So towards the end of Taft's term, Republicans were really upset with how little he had done in office. So that kind of created a division. Roosevelt attempted to run for a third term under the Socialist Party, and then there was a Democratic nominee. So because Republicans and Socialists had very similar ideology, the Republican Party split votes, paving the way for Democratic nominee Woodrow Wilson to be president. So we're going to write Taft right here. So President Woodrow Wilson, he attacked tariffs, bankings, and trusts. On Wilson's first day in office, he called a special session of Congress because he wanted to lower the tariffs. So he signed the Underwood Tariff, which was passed in 1913, and this lowered tariffs and also included a graduated income tax. The Federal Reserve Act was formed in 1914, and all that did was it switched our currency. Instead of having like gold or silver backed, we now had what we use today, dollar bills. Also, the Clayton Antitrust Act was signed, so that just really strengthened the very weak wording of the Sherman Antitrust Act and was far more effective. It also created the Federal Trade Commission, or the FTC. The FTC just protected unfair trade practice. Also, under Wilson, he had generally opposed any laws protecting farmers, unions, children. He tried to stay away from that. But towards the end of his term, he was persuaded to sign the Federal Farm Loan Act and the Child Labor Act. So we're going to write Wilson right there. So African Americans were facing pretty severe discrimination after the Plessy v. Ferguson ruling. So especially in the Deep South, which that established Jim Crow laws and the separate but equal. And really, the Jim Crow and separate but equal really just manifested the idea of cultural and white supremacy. So, one leader was Booker T. Washington. He was a former slave and founded the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. And Washington believed that Black people had to work for their rights and basically do that by learning a trade. Next, another leader is W.E.B. Du Bois. And he was the first African-American to receive his PhD from Harvard, and he also worked in collaboration with many other leaders to form the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP. He believed that Blacks did not have to gain their rights, that they were given to them no matter your economic standing, whether you had a job or not. So at first, Du Bois' philosophy was widely accepted. And then over time, people began to give Washington's idea more merit. So now we're going to talk about editor Ida B. Wells. She was the editor of a newspaper in Memphis, Tennessee, and she advocated for the equal treatment of African Americans, especially if they were ever convicted of a crime or even placed in jail. Because African Americans, if you ended up in jail, you were pretty much lynched, no matter what you did. So many people confuse lynching with just being hung. It's not. It is being violently beaten, hung, and murdered. So eventually, as her popularity grew and grew, she received many, many death threats and had to move up north for her safety. So right here, we're going to write African Americans. And then over here, we're going to write Du Bois, Washington, and Wells. Okay, so the Progressive Era really just opened the door for women to advocate for their rights. So Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton had worked very hard in the 1800s to gain their right to vote. Eventually, as they aged, they had to pass on their legacy to advocates like Carrie Chapman Catt, who spearheaded the National American Women's Suffrage Association, or the NAWSA. And the organization, of course, advocated for women's right to vote. Also advocating was Alice Paul. She took a more militant approach by picketing and parading and strikes. So eventually in 1920, the 19th Amendment was passed and women gained the right to vote. Another influential member of the Progressive Reformers was Margaret Sanger, and before her, it was very difficult to get birth control, but she was one of the first to openly distribute birth control to anyone who needed it or wanted it. This also set precedence for the idea of Planned Parenthood. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in 1911 was tragic. The fire was tragic. It killed 146 workers, mostly women, and that was because of the unfair labor protections. A fire broke out on the 8th floor, and because when doors were locked from the outside and windows were barred, it made it very difficult to escape. So Florence Kelley advocated for the Supreme Court case ruling in Mueller v. Oregon, which shortened the women's workday. Also included some other protections to help women. Eventually, the case made it very hard for women to actually get a job because they had to work such a short workday. When a woman and a man were up for the same position, it likely went to the man. So we are going to write women's rights. And then right here, we are going to write Kat and Paul. Singer here. And Kelly here. I forgot to mention earlier with Upton Sinclair that living conditions were a big deal, so we're going to write that right here. So that pretty much wraps up the Progressive Era. It was a time of just a ton of change and needed reform, and all of these amazing people made that happen. So there will be a 3.5-hour test on the covered material on May 6th, which will have a writing component. Prepare as needed. Thank you.